For more on the fallout from the Epstein files, we can now bring in Murtaza Hussein, a national security and foreign affairs reporter for Drop Site News. Thank you so much for joining us today on the program. Now, we've been discussing here the fallout in France with former culture minister Jack Lang, but to head back to the U.S. for a moment, the Trump administration is continuing to face fierce scrutiny over its handling of the release of the files in the Jeffrey Epstein case. Ghislaine Maxwell is scheduled to testify tomorrow before the House Oversight Committee in Congress. Her lawyers have said, though, she won't be talking. So what do you make of that? I mean, I feel like she does have more to tell. And is her keeping silent? She's angling for a pardon. What's the strategy here?
Well, on numerous occasions, Trump has indicated that he could be open to giving a pardon to Ghislaine Maxwell. The conditions of her incarceration have changed, have become eased over the time of his administration. And I do think that there's still a fierce political fight to prevent further disclosures from this archive of documents, of which we still only have a fraction. And furthermore, to hide certain embarrassing and incriminating details from people that Ghislaine Maxwell may know about. So I do think that this is still a live issue. And if you see statements from certain U.S. policymakers like Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna, who've been very vocal about further disclosure of the Epstein files, they've said that this scandal and the crimes, as they put it, entailed or revealed in these documents goes far beyond what we know presently. Implicates many, many more powerful people whose names maybe have been redacted at the moment, but are still known by certain parties. And in the words of Thomas Massie, it could go beyond Watergate and Iran-Contra and many, many of the other most notorious scandals in contemporary American history. So I do think that there's strong reason to negotiate or make some sort of deal with Ghislaine Maxwell on the part of the Trump administration to suppress some of those embarrassing details or even criminal details that she would be a person who'd have, in all likelihood, some privy to.
Now, excuse me, Murtaza, Hillary and Bill Clinton, too, are caught up in this. They've been asked to appear in Congress. Do you think the Republicans are using the opportunity to score political points?
Well, the irony that Donald Trump has repeatedly said that this is primarily a Democrat issue, and he calls it a Democrat hoax, and many terms like that, trying to imply that the partisan framing of the issue is much more on the Democrat side. In a way, ironically, there is a grain of truth to that, in that Epstein was somebody who's very close with the Clintons. He was very involved in the Clinton Foundation. He was very much embedded in this sort of center-left liberal establishment, the Bill Gates Foundation, many other figures. The problem is that Trump is also very implicated with Epstein personally, because he was a Democrat until relatively recently in his political career. He became a Republican only somewhere in the last decade and a half or so. I think that he is trying to use it for partisan purposes today, but the problem is that he himself is clearly very implicated in this for that reason. And I don't think that framing it that way is very compelling to most people, because today it's a Republican administration that he is serving in, which is working to suppress or obfuscate or downplay these very, very grave allegations. So ultimately, I don't think that strategy will be successful for a number of reasons.
Murtaza, over here in Europe, the British government is in turmoil over Lord Mendelssohn's links to Epstein, and that's putting pressure on the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, because obviously he had appointed him to be the U.S. ambassador, the British ambassador to the U.S. So this seems to highlight an appalling lack of judgment there. What do you think the long-term fallout would be?
Well, seeing it from the U.S. perspective is very ironic, because to date, there hasn't really been any political fallout on that scale in the U.S., where most of these crimes took place. And it's interesting seeing that in the U.K., there's been some limited, retribution or some limited fallout politically, and it may be a bit more than that. But to date, they've succeeded in suppressing that sort of consequence in the U.S. political system. And I do think that if you look in the U.K. perspective, that there were warning signs for many, many years. People have been warned about Peter Mandelson being appointed to this role. And if you look in the Epstein files, he was not just someone who had passing contact with Epstein. He was like intimate confidant over a number of years. And he was also involved in Epstein's own political intelligence activities. He was a frequent, his name comes up frequently in many of those emails. So I do think that him being removed is probably a foreseeable outcome of this scandal. But I don't think it stops there at all. It'd be either in the UK context or in the US or even globally, where Epstein really did have a tremendous web of connections over many, many years.
Now, Murtaza, one of the things that's been reported on a lot, of course, is the fallout regarding young women being trafficked. But another big revelation has been the scope of Epstein's connections, his contacts. Some people have described him as a collector of people. And these connections, they reach into government, as we've just been discussing, but also into intelligence agencies. And I understand you've been reporting on his links to the Israeli government. Could you tell us more about that?
So Epstein was, not just a social, not just a, you could say, a networker with elites, but he was actually an actor in many ways. He was actively working to facilitate diplomatic, intelligence, and economic deals around the world. And one individual with whom he had a particularly close relationship was former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. We've done a number of stories which were actually predated these Epstein file releases, which were based on a separate hacked email inbox from Barack, which shows thousands of messages with Epstein over many, many years. And it wasn't just they were talking about meeting or their personal lives or elite networking and so forth, although they were, but they were also talking about specific intelligence deals, political negotiations that Epstein and Barack were engaging with, many cases for the benefit of the state of Israel. And a couple of stories we did, you can see them on Dropside News. There's a whole series. We're still working on it. But, Epstein helped arrange a back channel diplomatic negotiations between Barack and Russian officials, including Vladimir Putin, to find a way to end the Syrian conflict, to have a regime change in Syria and change the leader to a pro-Russian leader amenable to Israel in 2013. He also helped set up talks between the Israelis and the Mongolian government, Cote d'Ivoire, many, many other countries as well, too. And those talks later became the seeds of formal security deals later signed by the government. So Epstein was involved in managing these deals, helping them lay the groundwork for them, and what you can call these track two negotiations. And by that, I mean that he would lay the groundwork with intelligence and economic deals and so forth. Helping embed Israeli surveillance technology firms in many of these countries. And thereafter, those talks would blossom in the course of a year or two into formal state visits and then formal agreements that were signed between the two states. And that happened in many, many countries over a long period of time. So I do think that this is a window into the fact that Epstein was not merely just someone who was a gadfly between all these different states and individuals. He had ideological interests, he had specific relationships and specific deals he was making. He was very much an active player in these deals, and his relationship with Barack are a window into his world, his role in Israeli politics and Israeli security making.
Now, some maybe conspiracy theorists have said, oh, he was an agent for Mossad or he worked for U.S. intelligence. But I mean, do you believe that? And what he was doing, how different was it than actually working for an intelligence agency? Because it does sound like he's, with his connections, he's sort of acting in such a manner like a spy.
Yeah, I don't think that Jeffrey Epstein worked for the Mossad or worked for any intelligence agency per se. As far as all the information we have, it doesn't suggest that. But that said, I did seem like someone. He did seem like he was somebody who maybe was above that per se. Because if you look at these communications with Barack and the way that they were operating, it was much more like the Mossad was working for him in these cases. And which I mean is that he and Barack would discuss the deployment of Israeli, in this case, surveillance technology firms, which are linked to Unit 8200 and Unit 81 and other parts of the Israeli security establishment. And they would deploy them into these countries to set up shop and to make economic deals and embed themselves with certain governments. But, it wasn't, by no means was he in a hierarchy where he was taking orders from the head of Mossad or anything like that. The communications at least don't suggest that. It seemed like he was above that and he was part of the strata. And I would say that he was sort of in this world of non-state actors. You can call it the billionaire class or whatever, how you would describe it, who are very important political actors in their own right, and they have global connections and very expansive powers and interests, but they're not embedded in any formal state hierarchy or answerable to that. They're kind of the product of a post-Cold War neoliberal world where institutions themselves have been sort of downgraded in importance, and the power of private capital and private individuals has grown by leaps and bounds. And Epstein was really a product of that world. So he had ties to Israeli intelligence and Russian intelligence, seemingly, and American intelligence as well too, and many, many other countries. But he was by no means someone who was a card-carrying member of any establishment. He was above and beyond that, but then he was very powerful, not in spite of that, but because of his status as a powerful, private, wealthy individual.
Now, Murtaza, some former Israeli officials have publicly denied that Epstein worked with Mossad. So, how should our viewers weigh those denials against the evidence that you've uncovered? Because you've also had access to other emails, correct? Not just stuff that's been revealed in the Epstein files dump.
That's correct. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of our stories have actually been based not on the files dump, although those have been helpful in many ways, but on these private emails, in this case with Barack and Epstein over a number of years. And I saw that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed these emails numerous times. But it's fascinating because he's trying to place it into the context of Israeli domestic politics and partisan politics, where Netanyahu and Barack are rivals, and Netanyahu is really trying to use Epstein and his relationship with Barack as a weapon against his political rivals, including Barack and people who are more on the center left in Israel, whom he does not like, and he would like to associate with Epstein, and while separating himself. Problem is that some of these documents and some of the lawsuits have come out have shown that, at least on one occasion, Epstein also helped broker at a meeting between Netanyahu and officials from J.P. Morgan. It seems to help discuss a certain gas deal that would later came to fruition, the Leviathan gas deal, and financing for that. So he did have connections kind of across the board, and to some degree, at least, in Israeli politics and society. But I think more importantly than that is that while maybe for Netanyahu it's a domestic partisan political issue, I think for the majority of people watching this, whether in the U.S. or the Europe or even in Israel itself, they would note that this really was a situation where Epstein was acting, in his own view, for the betterment of the state and its interests and so forth, which he had some ideological tie to, and not for the benefit of a particular faction or group within Israel. And again, it wasn't just Israel who was involved, and he had ties at very high levels in many countries around the world. But certainly, the communications we have show a very extensive and unique interest and effort in furthering the state of Israel, Israel's interests. For many, many years on the part of Epstein, in part through his relationship with Barack, but not limited to that.
Now, in your view, why has this particular aspect of Epstein's network been less covered by the media than his other crimes or his political connections?
Well, initially, one could say that perhaps people didn't want to cover it because the emails were based on a different document set. They're based on this hack, and we went through an extensive verification process, but it was our verification process, and maybe a few other small outlets also did the same. But now I think that excuse does not really hold water because now many of these emails that we reported on have been validated by their inclusion in the Epstein file releases by the federal government as well too, or the Department of Justice in the U.S. So I think that there's not really an excuse practically or journalistically to ignore it any longer. So I think that it has to be political then in this case, because there are these very, very glaring and egregious examples of this sort of coordination reconstructed over a very long period of time. And we're reporting on it, and it's there, and it's validated as well too. And yet, we have kind of been alone in reporting that for the most part. And, there's a degree of complexity to the stories and so forth. But, I think we're going to keep reporting on it. We do encourage other outlets with larger budgets and resources to also look at it too. But in lieu of that, we're glad to continue doing the reporting. And we have more stories to come, which have been aided by these new Epstein releases as well.
Murtaza, thank you for speaking with us today. That's Murtaza Hussein, National Security and Foreign Affairs reporter for Drop Site News.